My name's Nathan Queener. I'm a fisheries biologist with the Mattole Salmon Group. I have coordinated our monitoring work for a little over 10 years now. Richard, do you want to say a couple things about yourself? Richard, you're muted. Okay, Richard is still muted.
Thanks, Justin. Sorry about that. I needed to have authority to unmute. I'm the executive director for the Mattole Salmon Group. I see in our audience is Gary Fish Peterson, is also with the Mattole Salmon Group. And if we really want to go for questions back at the beginning of our monitoring program, we can include Gary if he chooses to participate in any questions. So actually, it's pretty interesting because we have Gary was a founding member of the MSGs, and we talk about that monitoring program. We go back to, we've got the whole period covered here with representatives from the Salmon Group. So glad Gary's on board. That's it, Nathan.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. And hope that everything works. Okay, that looks pretty good. Okay, so I'm just to give you a little overview, I'll be talking about what we know about the abundance and distribution of salmon and steelhead in the Mattole River watershed, and then transition into the ways that the habitat for fish has changed in the watershed over the years and is changing. And then talk about, sort of bring those two things together and talk about what we think the most important restoration work to be done is in order to increase the abundance of these runs. So the Mattole Salmon Group was founded in 1980 with the mission of restoring native salmon runs in the Mattole watershed back to self-sustaining levels. In the early years of the Salmon Group, a lot of that work focused on direct population enhancement, rearing fish, stages of that, which you can see in some of these pictures. Currently, the Salmon Group is not doing any direct population enhancement or fish rearing. And our focus is primarily on in-stream habitat restoration. And throughout the history of the Salmon Group, there's been a strong focus on monitoring salmon populations, both as a way to see how we're doing in terms of our mission, and also to learn more about the fish. Despite salmon being perhaps one of the most well-studied fish in the history of the world, there's still an awful lot we don't know about these creatures, and an awful lot that we still would like to learn about their life history. So I'm going to start here just with a very brief overview of the three species of salmonids that we have in the Mattole River watershed. I'm sure some of you are familiar with these, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. So we have Chinook salmon, also known as kings. This is the largest of the three salmonids that we have here. Adults will be in excess of 3 feet long sometimes. These fish are the adults are the first to come in the fall, typically with the first big fall rains that open the river mouth. Spawning time runs into typically early January. And because these are very large fish, they will spawn in large water. They'll spawn in the main stem Mattole, sometimes in areas where the substrate is very large, like almost cantaloupe sized. But if there's enough water, they'll also spawn in smaller streams. Once the juvenile fish emerge from the gravel, they typically only stay in the watershed for a few months before migrating to sea. This is so the juvenile Chinook are not in most juvenile Chinook are not in the watershed over the summer, which is a key difference with coho salmon, also known as silver salmon. Coho come in a little bit later than Chinook. Prime spawning time is December to early February for coho, and they will spawn in typically in much smaller water. This is a fish that really needs low gradient streams. The juvenile coho need slow water habitat during the winter. They spend nearly an entire year in freshwater, and they need some slow, almost pond-like water in the winter to escape high winter flows. And then they are also susceptible to drying streams and low flows in the summer, since they are rearing in the watershed throughout the summer. They also have the most limited warm water tolerance of the three species. And so they are restricted to cooler rearing locations than the third species that I'll be focusing on, steelhead. Steelhead and rainbow trout are the same species. Steelhead is just a rainbow trout that has gone to the ocean, or a rainbow trout is a steelhead that never goes to the ocean. Some adult steelhead will come in with the Chinook as soon as the river mouth opens in the fall, but typically steelhead spawning occurs later and tends to peak in around March. But there will be steelhead spawning into May. And we also have a very small run of summer run steelhead. The adults come into the river in late spring or early summer. Over summer in the river, in deep pools or cold water locations, and then spawn with the first rains in the fall. And along with the Eel River, we are actually the southernmost watershed that has summer run steelhead. Juvenile steelhead will stay in freshwater anywhere from a couple months to a couple years. They are much more well adapted to faster water than juvenile coho or Chinook to some extent. And the adults are also better adapted to spawning in much steeper streams. So you will find steelhead in streams where coho and Chinook simply never go. So even in streams where you have step pools or cascades, steelhead will find a place to spawn and rear. And in fact, some of our best habitat in the watershed for steelhead is probably in some of these steeper streams. So those are the three native salmonids we have. I'm also going to include an honorary fourth anadromous fish here, the Pacific lamprey, which is a native species here. Some folks call these eels. This is a fish that I'm sneaking in just in part because their life cycle has some key similarities with salmon and steelhead, and also because they've just been vastly underappreciated. What you're seeing here, the one photo in the middle there is a juvenile lamprey that's just transforming from being an amosete into an adult lamprey that will go out to the ocean. So the adults live their life in the ocean, sucking on, what's the word here? Not sucking, but they do suck on to large fish like tuna or salmon, or whales or sharks, and they will feed on these larger fish as the fish swim around doing their business. And then they spend some years in the ocean. I don't think anybody knows exactly how many, and then come back to freshwater to spawn. They, unlike salmon, lamprey can move rocks with their mouths, so they will construct their nests, their redds, partially by moving rocks around with their mouths, which the pair of them here in this photo is doing that. They'll also use their tail. They spawn. When the eggs hatch, the amicetes, the larval lamprey, burrow down into the substrate for up to 9 years and filter feeding, and then head out to the ocean. So another species here that ties the freshwater and the marine environments together, brings a lot of marine nutrients back into freshwater. Really important native species for tribal people here through the millennia, and also for the entire ecosystem. Okay, so when talking about how many fish there are, one question that often comes up is how many fish were there? And in the Mattole, like most rivers around here, we do not have a great answer to that question, at least a quantitative answer. But it seems safe to say there used to be a lot more fish, based on the fact that they used to be a staple here, both for tribal people and Euro-American settlers. And so I wanted to just share a few accounts here that give an example of how there used to be many more salmon and steelhead. This photo here came from a website maintained by Laura Kuski with the Mattole Valley Historical Society. Those are Chinook salmon speared out of Honeydew Creek in 1914. And then a couple quotes here that came from a wonderful compilation that the local historian Susie Van Kirk put together of newspaper accounts of fish in the Mattole. She also did this for the eel and I think several other area rivers, and these are available online. It's really fascinating. But anyway, the Ferndale Enterprise in 1910, talking about how there were about 1,000 Chinook salmon spawning on one riffle near Edwardsburg. Newspapers of this time were certainly sometimes hyperbolic, but still. And then the Blue Lake Advocate a year later in 1911, with 2.5 tons of salmon taken from the Mattole River near Petrolia, John Titus, assisted by David Ball and Albert Thompson, arrived in Ferndale Tuesday, the fish being taken to Weot for disposal to a salmon buyer. We don't really know a lot of details, but there was definitely a commercial fishery, or at least attempts at a commercial fishery in the Mattole in the late 1800s. So a lot more fish than we have currently. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at one point in the 1960s made some estimates of how much available spawning gravel there was, and came up with estimates of about, they thought there was the potential for 20,000 adult salmon and steelhead at that point. But they were really just focused on spawning gravel, and that wasn't counting actual fish. So in terms of counting actual fish, there are 3 main methods that the Salmon Group has used over the years to look at the abundance of fish in the watershed. Those are spawning ground surveys, where in the winter, when there are adult fish in the watershed, we wade and boat stretches of the river and tributaries, looking for adult fish and their nests, their redds. This is easier in some stretches than others. And of course, in wet years like this year, it's a lot harder, and we know that we're missing fish because we can't get out because it's not safe or it's too turbid. And then something that we haven't done for about a decade, but another tool that has been used over the years is downstream migrant trapping. So the photo in the center there, with what looks like a metal pontoon boat, that is a rotary screw trap. As especially Chinook salmon outmigrate to the ocean in the spring, when they're going downriver, a subset of them are captured in that trap. and then counted, identified, and released. And then snorkel surveys. This is something that we use a lot in the summer, especially to look for juvenile coho salmon, and also some other species. And again, easier in some conditions than others. So just to give you all an overview here, the broad level overview, in terms of numbers of fish that we currently have. Chinook salmon, our estimates over the last decade or so have ranged from the low 300s to over 4,400. So in addition to the annual returns here, I'm showing what's called the depensation level. So all three of these species are listed as threatened under the Federal Endangered Species Act. As part of recovery planning for that, the federal agencies are required to come up with a recovery target, the number of individuals that there need to be in order to be considered recovered, and also the depensation level. And basically, once a species gets to the depensation level, it's considered that extinction is imminent, both because of genetic issues, basically inbreeding, and also to some extent just random bad luck. Once you have too few individuals on the landscape, the population is just really prone to some of them getting eaten, males and females not finding each other, stuff like that. So basically the Chinook salmon population, we've been above the depensation level most years, well above the depensation level. And we did have one year in the winter of 2017-18 when our estimate was actually that there were over 4,000 fish above what is the federal recovery target. And that was a pretty amazing year in terms of abundance. Certainly, I haven't seen anything like that before or since. Steelhead, we have a much poorer idea of how many adult steelhead there are, just because they spawn over such a long period of time, 6 months at least, and over a much larger portion of the watershed than Chinook or coho. But based on the information we have, we think that there are 2,000 to 5,000 adults coming back every year. And we see juvenile steelhead pretty much all over. So this is definitely the most robust population of the three species at present. And then coho salmon, this is definitely the least robust population of the three. So we estimate that there have been fewer than 50 adult coho annually since 2009. And the spawning is almost entirely restricted to a very small portion of the watershed. So I'm gonna go quickly through these next couple of slides, I think here, because I want to make sure to get to talking about the habitat. But this is basically a time series showing our estimates for adult returns from 1981 to the last winter. And there are two different colors on the graph just because of different methods making these estimates. And there is about a 10-year gap there in the middle where we don't have watershed-wide estimates. But point here being that Chinook salmon returns are extremely variable year to year, and that those first years in the early 80s seem to be some of the best ones, until a few years in the last decade, especially that 2017-18 run, when Chinook were very abundant. But the average over the last decade is about 1,300 fish. We see Chinook salmon spawning really throughout the main stem. In most years, there seems to be more spawning in the main stem atoll than anywhere else. But in wet years, they will come into very small streams. So these two maps here, the one on the left side of the screen Each of those green dots is a Chinook salmon red recorded by surveyors over 12 years of surveys. The winter of 2013-14 is shown on the right. You can see all those green dots, or nearly all those green dots, are downstream of honeydew. This was a year where we had a bunch of rain in September and then very little rain until February, and we saw a huge amount of Chinook spawning in the lower third of the river because there simply was not enough flow for them to go further upstream. And a year like this just really emphasizes that these fish need good habitat throughout the watershed because we do have a lot of variability, and especially for Chinook, the variability in wintertime conditions and flow really has a huge influence on where they can access. So moving on to steelhead, we really see juvenile steelhead almost anywhere there's water in the summer and where a 2-foot-long adult fish could conceivably get to. It's really pretty remarkable. That map there is showing dots are actually individual pools where steelhead were seen. Black dots are pools where no steelhead were seen. This was a survey that was focused on coho salmon, but basically the point being almost everywhere we looked, we saw steelhead throughout the watershed. And they are quite abundant in most places, most years. So this is primarily tributary streams, but the average number that we'll see in a pool doing these surveys in the summer, the average number of juveniles is around 30. This is in stark contrast to coho salmon. So the map here basically shows the same surveys that the steelhead map showed, but you can see that the red dots showing the pools where coho salmon were seen are almost entirely concentrated in the southern third, or even maybe the southern 10% of the watershed. The distribution of coho salmon spawning and rearing in the last decade and even 2 decades and maybe longer than that has really been restricted to the Whitethorn Valley. And this is for several reasons. It is sort of the best natural coho salmon habitat in terms of being very low, having a lot of low gradient stream, having relatively moderate summer stream temperatures, and having much more stable geology than much of the watershed. There's just a lot less landslides and natural sediment input in the Whitethorn Valley than in the rest of the watershed. But this is also a concern just in terms of the persistence of the population, because in some years there's not really enough water for adult fish to make it up there, at least easily. And so one thing we focused on with coho, or we're attempting to focus on, is making sure there are other areas of the watershed that are suitable for coho to rear to try to support that population. So this just shows numbers of adult coho salmon. The top graph there is the equivalent to the Chinook graph that I showed previously, and then the bottom graph with green just shows the raw count of live adult coho that we've seen in surveys. Statewide, throughout the range of coho salmon in California, the returns in 2008 really decreased. Ocean survival for those fish was apparently very, very poor. And we saw that here too, where all of a sudden our coho population just almost disappeared. There are some years after that where, even though we didn't see adult coho, actually every year, we know there were some because we see juvenile coho in the summer doing snorkel surveys. But it's clear that post 2007, there has been a big decrease in coho in the watershed. And honestly, every year it's kind of a miracle that they've survived just because our numbers are so low. But we've actually seen more juveniles here the last 3 years than a number of years previously. And so that's been quite encouraging. This still probably only represents a population of maybe 20 to 25 adult females returning to spawn, but that's way better than just a couple. We did have 1 year in 2019 where it looked like there may have just been one successful coho salmon red in the entire watershed, which is definitely not that far from extinction or extirpation. Okay, so now we're going to talk about habitat and changes in the watershed. So I'm going to show you all a couple air photos, actually 3 aerial photos, taken in a part of the watershed that probably most people who have been to the Mattole are familiar with. So right in the middle of this photo is A.W. Way County Park, which is about halfway between Petrolia and Honeydew. This is a photo taken in 1941, which is before there was really substantial and widespread timber harvest in the watershed. And I just want to point out a couple things here. The primary one being the presence of what are clearly very tall, large trees in the lower half of the photo there. Looking at the shadows too on the river there, right by A.W. Way Park, you can tell that there are a lot of very large Douglas fir near the river. We also see some orchards, I guess both walnut and apple orchards there, grassland, hay fields. And so then here is the same area, an aerial photo taken in 1965. And probably a number of you know the story. This happened all over the north, to some extent, over much of the North Coast. But in the 1950s and 60s, the Mattole really experienced a logging boom. And in particular, the network of skid roads that went in as part of that is just, I find it kind of mind-boggling. So here we have a pretty stark contrast here in this photo. We've lost nearly all of that large timber in the southern half of this photo, and we just have a maze of skid trails in its place. It's kind of hard to directly compare the river between these two photos, I'd say, although you can. Here, I'm going to flip back to 1941 and then back to 1965. Clearly, the channel is wider, and you can see a lot more of the channel because all those large trees near the channel have been removed. Okay, and then going forward in time to 2019, same area here. You can see really significant regeneration of the forest. All that area where you could see all those skid trails, for the most part, you can't see them anymore because you have very vigorous, I think in most cases, natural reforestation. And also I want to point out on the top half of the photo, I don't know if folks can actually see my cursor or not, but up here north of A-Way Park, look at all these trees. And then if we go back in time to both 1965 and 1941, those trees were not there. That was all grassland up there. So some pretty substantial landscape changes. And I picked this area because of A-Way Park and people being familiar with that. But you can pretty much do the same thing with any portion of the Mattole, and pretty much see the same progression of the way the vegetation has changed over time. Um, and so to a large extent, I would say that our current restoration priorities can still all be traced back to the confluence of the two historic floods in 1955 and 1964 that occurred on top of this landscape that had really just been dramatically altered by the tractor logging of the 1950s into the early 1970s. So we're still really living with the consequences of that, and really focused on doing restoration work that tries to ameliorate those consequences. And basically the big three are excessive in-stream sediment, especially a lot more silt and sand than we really want to see in these stream channels. A lack of in-stream wood. Large trees in the channel are hugely important in this region as an agent of complexity in the channel. And because so many of our streamside forests were cut, and a lot of the large down trees that were in these channels historically were removed when these streams were used as skid roads, and also because of somewhat misguided concerns about fish passage and log jams being a barrier to fish passage. We have a serious deficit of wood in our streams. And then the third big issue is low summer stream flows. And it does appear that we have declining summer stream flows over time. For folks who want to learn more about that, I highly recommend checking out work that Eli Asarian, who's a hydrologist based in Eureka, has done looking at this up and down the North Coast. There's definitely a long-term trend of the low flows in the summer becoming lower and lower. And this is not only on the Mattole, and this is not only in streams where there is human water extraction. It's also in some streams where there's really no or very little human water use. And so while we don't have a super nuanced understanding of what's driving this, it seems pretty clear that the condition of our forests is a major factor, just because we have more forest and more dense forest comprised of water-hungry young trees on the landscape than perhaps ever in history on this landscape. So just to delve a little more deeply into those three things and then talk about the restoration work that can be done. So I just wanted to show this to partially put the erosion and sedimentation from the 1950s and 60s here in context. So this comes from a study where a bunch of folks sampled sediment cores offshore in the deposition zone of the Eel River. And what you see there is you see that there's one, I don't know if that's a decade or that must be more than a decade, but basically following the 1955 and 64 floods, you see that super high bar showing a sedimentation rate that is at least double anything that appears to have happened for over 600 years. And then some slightly lower rates since then, but still we have more sediment, especially sand and silt, coming out of these coastal rivers than really any time in the recent past. So that's still a huge issue. So we are actually seeing some improvement, though, in the Mattole, especially in the Mattole tributaries. Just real briefly, this is some work we did looking at changes in the amount of sand and silt in these streams between 2001 and 2011, and we saw these nice declines in every single location sampled, where in most cases there was less than half the amount of silt and sand on the stream bed as in 2001. Okay, so so the implications for fish from, I'm sorry, the chat window is right in the middle of the slide and I can't see. Okay, so important reasons why this matters for fish. So typically spawning success for these species will be greater with less in-stream sediment, both because there's less chance that their redds will scour out catastrophically or be buried and entombed, and also because the developing eggs need water flow through the gravel in order to carry away metabolic wastes and deliver oxygen. This is perhaps most important for Chinook. And so we think that given that we are seeing declines in in-stream sand and silt, that probably Chinook egg to fry survival should be increasing in a lot of places. This is a photo taken of some beautiful substrate for Chinook, and a big Chinook red, that depression behind the sedge in the main stem atoll. Juvenile fish, especially steelhead, most particularly steelhead, also really rely on substrate for cover, hiding from predators and from high flows, high velocities. And so as the sand and silt gets washed out from between the cobbles and larger substrate, they have more places to hide. We're also definitely seeing a lot of alder and willow, even in the main stem down near Petrolia, that has been established and has persisted now for over a decade. Often when you have a lot of fine sediment in a channel, you might get willow and alder that gets established for a couple of years, but then a higher flow will wash it away because the stream bed's just too mobile. But we're really seeing definite increases in the amount of alder and willow on the bars down here. We're also seeing some promising changes in the estuary, the Mattole estuary and lagoon. But it's not all quite that rosy, because there are areas where the geology is just more naturally clay rich, seem to be the slowest to recover. And also one potential downside to this, especially for fish that need slow water habitat like coho salmon, is that as the amount of sediment going into these systems has decreased, the river channel downcuts, it incisors. And what tends to happen in the absence of large wood in the stream channel is you get these channels that look a lot like canals, and the stream channel cuts down below the level of the floodplain. And so in high flows, you don't really have a connected floodplain that water and fish like juvenile coho can spread out on to escape the high velocity flows. Okay, so that was a little more about fine sediment. Now moving on to focus on wood in the stream. So there's definitely a relationship between the occurrence of pools, especially deeper pools in a lot of these tributary streams, and the incidence of large wood in the stream. The supply of wood to these streams was really decreased by the timber harvest from 1950 to 1975, before there were protections for riparian areas. And So since then, basically, a lot of the wood that's left in the stream, it's been decaying over time. That's what happens. But there's been very little new wood of sufficient size to do interesting things for the habitat coming in naturally. And this is particularly a problem in these larger tributary streams, where you really need a, at least couple 100-year-old Douglas fir um, to really be large enough to do something. Smaller pieces, the stream is just going to carry them away. And this is going to continue to be a problem for, honestly, hundreds of years from a habitat standpoint. We really need these streamside stands to grow and become large enough to contribute effective in-stream wood naturally. But that's a pretty slow process. So here, whoop, going back. Okay. Now moving on to the low flow issue, which I will say is definitely less straightforward in terms of the in-stream wood and the fine sediment issue, just because we probably understand it a lot less well. But what you're hopefully seeing here are two graphs. These were actually made by John Williams, a retired hydrologist who lives in Petrolia, showing the flow at the USGS gauge on the Mattole River at Petrolia. And so on the left side of the screen, you see the annual median flow from 1950 to 2010, and you can basically see there's no change there over time, no discernible change. But if you look at the annual minimum flow, the lowest flow of the year recorded at that gauge, there's definitely a serious decrease. Looking at that trend line in the 1950s and 60s, the average minimum flow would have been around 28 cubic feet per second, CFS. And then down in the 2000s, that drops to probably below 20. And if you extended this graph for the 13 years that have elapsed since it was made, that line would probably continue to go down. It certainly wouldn't go back. So clearly, we have a low flow problem. It seems to be getting worse. In some places, in some tributaries, in some neighborhoods, human water conservation can make a real difference. But if you do some rough math about the amount of water that humans are likely using for all uses in the watershed, and even if you're very generous, you don't really find the missing 15 CFS that would bring our minimum flows back up to where it seems like they were in the 1950s and 1960s. And of course, also, in some cases, humans were using less water in the 50s and 60s, but in some cases more. There were actually irrigated hay fields at that time in the lower river down here, and that doesn't happen at that scale anymore. I'd make the argument that throughout the watershed, the condition of our forests is really the thing that we can influence, that really has the potential to make a measurable impact in getting a little more water in the stream, in the river and the streams in the summer. And of course, climate change here is definitely a factor. Warmer temperatures, more evaporation, more transpiration in particular. You crank up the heat and the trees are just having to use more water to keep up. So that's probably a factor here. That's almost certainly a factor here as well as forest condition. So clearly this is bad news for fish. When the stream dries up, that's no good at all. This is actually a picture from the summer of 2021, which was pretty depressing. Looking at streams, some which I never thought particularly had a low flow problem, but there were some really bad conditions in the summer of 2021. This is Shoals Creek between Edwardsburg and Honeydew. There's relatively little human water use in this watershed. It's all way up at the ridge top. and thousands and thousands of feet of this channel went dry that summer, and definitely thousands of steelhead died in the process. The other factor here, that the summer of 2021 was really a example of just the peril that this puts fish in, is that the main stem mattole can be very good rearing habitat in the summer for juvenile steelhead. Probably any of you who have spent time at the river in the summer have seen them. But it can also get too hot for steelhead. It will get above 75 degrees during the day. And once the temperature gets above a certain threshold, the steelhead stop being active. They find any little cool water spot they can find and they hunker down. They aren't feeding. They're typically vulnerable to predation. And if they aren't feeding, they aren't growing. And so these summers where you have hot temperatures that where you have a lot of time above that threshold where steelhead are able to be actively feeding, you're just going to have much poorer growth and much poorer survival. On the flip side of this, I would say that some of the good trends in sedimentation that we've been seeing and the establishment of more willow and alder in the main stem mattole, when you have more complexity like that in the stream channel, you get more heterogeneity in the stream temperatures. You get more little pockets of cool water because the water is being forced through the gravel and then is coming out again, having cooled down. So climate change is working against us here for sure, but the decreasing sediment loads are a positive. So another positive thing here, and also just trying to address this question of, where can we increase the quantity and the quality of habitat to increase its capacity to rear fish. The estuary and lagoon is clearly really important habitat for salmon and steelhead. So those two air photos are showing 2006 and 2019. There's been a real increase in the surface area of the lagoon and estuary, again, as sediment has flushed out. So these two photos, just in 2006, a surface area of 13 hectares and 23 hectares in 2019. And that trend certainly seems to be increasing. This is definitely important and helpful for fish. I'm sorry, excuse me again. I need to make sure I can see my slide. Okay, so we're skipping that one. Oh, but it wants, okay. So focusing for just a second on coho salmon, which I think, okay, so there are a couple things that are clearly the most important restoration actions for coho. As I previously mentioned, coho are very much restricted to the upper Whitethorn Valley. And Sanctuary Forest, our partner group based in Whitethorn, has done a great job over the last 20 years working on water conservation and really doing Herculean work in terms of reducing summer water withdrawals and making sure that people can have water storage during the summer. And that has made a measurable difference in the main stem mattole up near Whitethorn. And so that is certainly an area where changing human water use can help keep water in stream. But then there are some tributaries to the mattole up there, like Baker Creek, some of you might be familiar with, where there is no human water use and there's still a definite low flow problem. So this is just to say we need to both address forest condition and water conservation. And so in terms of coho, we're also trying to think where else in the watershed is there suitable habitat, and could habitat be made so it will support a coho population outside of this very small area where we currently see them. And so projects that put large wood in stream are really key in terms of making some of these areas that have low gradient habitat, but that's currently not in very good condition, suitable for coho in the future. This is just an example. So this is Shoals Creek again. So on the left there, you see a channel that looks a lot like a lot of Mattole tributary streams. I talked before about how as we see less sand and silt in these channels, which is a good thing, they do sometimes tend to become these fairly boring, what we often call bowling alleys. Just these long runs with relatively uniform depth, not a lot of pool development or cover. So putting wood in these channels can really help. It can be technically difficult and expensive. But here's just an example of the channel change. Pre-wood placement, I guess the wood has actually been placed in the photo on the left, but there hasn't been any high flow yet, so it hasn't done anything. But then on the right, you can see how putting wood in the stream has resulted in deposition of some nice sized spawning gravels. It's also brought the stream bed elevation up a little bit. So at higher flows now, or at lower high flows, the water will spill out onto the floodplain, and juvenile fish can take advantage of that floodplain habitat that's super important. So here's actually the same location, just a little different vantage. And there's a gray depression there in the stream channel. That's a nice steelhead red in this nice spawning gravel that was deposited because of that wood place there. So I'm almost done here, but just to touch on steelhead a little bit. So over the years, we've put a lot more focus on coho and Chinook because they're more imperiled, and also because a lot of the funding for restoration has been targeted at those species. So steelhead have been somewhat ignored. But there are, and certainly a lot of the restoration work done does benefit steelhead, but it's also worth focusing specifically on steelhead a little more. As I mentioned earlier, we think that rearing habitat in the main stem Mattole, in about the 45 miles of the Mattole from Ettersburg all the way to the river mouth, that's really important, rearing habitat in the summer when it's not too hot. And so again, decreasing sediment loads is probably the best thing that will, and ensuring that riparian vegetation continues to grow, the best thing that will help steelhead rear successfully in the main stem. Stream flow in the summer, most steelhead spend at least one summer in fresh water before going out to sea. So they need water. A lot of the streams with the best summer flow, it's fortuitous. They're actually in the King Range National Conservation Area and under BLM management. So they are conserved land where restoration and habitat conservation is a priority. But certainly focusing on streams that naturally have better summer flow for steelhead habitat is really important. And that photo there is actually an example of what happens when the main stem gets hot enough that all the fish are just tucked into any cold water they can find. You get some very dense schools. So I've focused primarily here just on fish, but I do really want to emphasize that the ability of fish to thrive, native fish to thrive in this watershed, is really dependent on the landscape. an awful lot of the issues that we have with fish habitat are really tightly related to forest condition. And so because this is really a landscape scale issue, and I think I think in-stream restoration is important. It's essential in order to keep these fish runs alive while the larger habitat recovers. And some of the natural processes that were disrupted, like big old trees falling into the stream, have gradually recalibrate over time. But we can put a ton of wood in the stream, but unless the larger landscape is in good shape, we aren't going to see thriving fish runs. And so I just wanted to end with actually this question, because I think it's especially maybe relevant right now as our whole region is seeing real changes in the cannabis economy, and sort of wondering what the next boom or what the next economic boom looks like. And so I think this is an important question for policymakers to consider, and really everybody to consider. How we try to move out of an economy that seems so boom and bust, and into something where long-term land stewardship is incentivized. And I need to wrap up because I think I'm out of time, and I don't have a great answer to that question anyway. But I think it's while we're doing these other things that are to some extent sort of band-aids, we also really need to work on this larger issue. That's all I have. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Yeah, that was great. Lots of challenges in the river, and thank you so much to Richard as well for joining us and for your work to protect these incredible creatures and for the health of our watersheds. We are now going to go into the question and answer part of tonight's presentation. And so I'm going to take or allow everybody to unmute themselves if they so choose. And we invite people to come on with their camera and ask questions live for Nathan or Richard. So everybody now has that ability. In the meantime, we did have some questions in the chat that I wanted to make sure we covered before we get to other questions that the rest of you may have. So one of them was just Gary Fish asking if we can provide a link to Eli Asarian's report on low flow trends in North Coast rivers and streams, if it's accessible online. And if so, I don't know if you, Nathan, or Richard are able to add that to the chat, but that would be great to learn more about this. And another question that that was asked a little ways back was, how is silt and sediment quantity and delivery affected by the recent trend of atmospheric river rainfall events? And do fast, high rainfall hydrological events benefit or impede ideal spawning riverbed gravel material? Is that something you could speak to?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it really depends on how much new sediment is coming into the system with those events. And so, if in a watershed where there's maybe been a lot of new poorly constructed roads, for example, you're probably actually going to have more material come in than that storm is going to move out of the channel and downstream. But hopefully what we're continuing to see here is because we think that it seems like on the whole, there are fewer sediment sources across the landscape, because those scars from the 1950s and 60s are definitely revegetating and healing naturally. And in general, it seems like people are taking better care of their roads. on the whole, you know, those events are probably helpful as long as sort of the overall condition of your watershed is improving and you aren't seeing new sediment sources develop. Because you know these bigger events do really move a huge amount of material in the rivers and streams, and definitely could result in some big changes.
Thank you. So another question in the chat was, what can we do to help, if anything? And maybe this dovetails also with how people can get involved with some of your fish counts and other work that you all are doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of what folks can do to help sort of depends on where they live and their situation. But sort of at the broadest level, I mean, I would say that because the health of these fish runs is so tied to the health of the larger landscape, you know, sort of being an involved citizen in terms of you know, land use policy and sort of what the broader society and culture looks like are important. But I mean, that's also sort of non-specific and maybe not that helpful. I think on more like a homestead scale, or you know, any sort of scale sort of nearer your dwelling, making sure that you're water barring your roads and you're maintaining those water bars. If you have the ability to have some summer water storage, so you know, certainly if you can avoid using surface water during the summer, and even in some cases wells are hydrologically connected to stream flow. And then you know, almost anybody who lives outside of you know, the center of town around here, you have at least some forest, and so trying to do some forest thinning and forest stewardship is also really important. And then sort of most tangibly, for people who want to get more involved, our main volunteer event every year is our summer steelhead dive, which is a snorkel survey where we rely on volunteers to snorkel basically the entire length of the Mattole in 2 days. No prior snorkeling experience is required, and we have gear that we can loan folks. So get in touch with me if you're interested in that. That's going to be June 28th and 29th this year.
Great, thank you. So yeah, we'd like to encourage anybody else to ask questions either in the chat or to turn your cameras on and ask directly. I guess one question that I had is, with fewer than 50 coho in the river most years, so you'd say, is there hope for coho in the Mattole? And I guess another thing related to that is, I noticed when we looked at the graphs, there was a break between 2002 and 2012, and I guess I wonder if we know, you know, what caused that decline that we were seeing in the coho numbers after 2002.
Yeah, so those graphs are a little confusing just because there's 10 years where we don't have watershed-wide data. But yeah, I mean, it appears there's definitely a real drop-off starting in 2008, which did seem to happen California-wide, and was probably related to really poor marine survival. But you know, basically, I think with the coho, I don't really know. There are a lot of unknowns, but it seems like the population was relatively low, but not critically low, for decades and decades. And I think maybe the combination of a year or a couple years with really poor marine survival, coupled with some really dry summers in there. It was the early 2000s when people first really started noticing the lack of summer flow in the mainstem Mattole upstream of Whitethorn. And so I think maybe those two things in combination with maybe a population that wasn't quite as robust as it looked, and maybe already was facing some genetic related challenges, are what was responsible for that pretty severe decline. In terms of if there's any hope for coho, you know, based on the numbers that we think we have, they should have been extirpated from this watershed a number of years ago, actually. So the fact that they keep coming back is really quite encouraging. You know, the last 3 years, the numbers have been a lot better. And the last 2 of those summers, we had pretty decent summer flow conditions, and probably survival was pretty darn good. So I definitely hold on to hope for that run. You know, it is a great example of how, even though we spend an awful lot of time and energy and money learning about these fish and monitoring these fish, there's still a lot about them that we don't know.
Gotcha. And so you think that the genetic diversity could still be maintained even with numbers that level?
I mean, based on the numbers, it shouldn't be, but we do actually know there's been some genetic work done, not super recently, but 5 or 6 years ago. And at that point, there was definitely an indication that there were some strays. There were adults from other watersheds that within the recent past had spawned in the Mattole. And so we were getting some gene flow from, you know, from the South Fork eel and from some streams on the Mendocino coast. And that is super important. I mean, while we all, you know, while most salmon do spawn in their natal stream, there are some that naturally stray and go to other watersheds, and that's really important from a genetic standpoint. And so, you know, I think that there is indication that we're getting some gene flow from other watersheds, and that's probably really helped keep the population alive.
And do we think that that's something that that the species is aware of and is consciously, you know, making these choices in order to diversify those genetics, or is it just?
I mean, I would think it's sort of baked in through years of evolution that some are explorers and go to new places, most are not. But you know, certainly there have been mudslides and huge rain events, and you know, populations have been naturally extirpated in the past, and then fish recolonize those places over time. So, you know, this is definitely a natural process that's been going on. The key is that you have to have nearby populations that are also robust enough in terms of numbers that you do get some, like there are fish there that can stray. So this sort of, from a recovery standpoint, the straying, it's really important to have coast-wide, you know, strong enough populations that you can have this exchange of genes happening between different rivers.
Thank you. So we have some other questions in the chat, but I had one other thing that kind of relates that I figured I'll ask first, and that is the difference with the Chinook counts between 2019 and 2017. I mean, those seem to be just drastic number differences between those 2 years. And I guess I wonder, is it common to see such variation between the years, and in terms of an average? I mean, obviously there was a low end and a high end with only 2 years in between, but could you speak a little bit more to, you know, why that might be, and kind of where more the mean numbers?
Yeah, I wish I knew, because that was a pretty extreme change. We were feeling really great about our Chinook run after, you know, in 2018, and then the next few years we were feeling considerably less great. I think that there are a couple things going on there. I'm sure that ocean survival played some role, and there's been a lot of research on ocean survival related to the larger river systems like the Sacramento and the Klamath. And there are a lot of things about that, about ocean survival and sort of ways to forecast ocean survival in those systems. They don't always get it right, but they definitely have a decent understanding of some of what's going on there. But our returns of adult Chinook don't really seem to correlate well with either Sacramento River or Klamath River returns. So it seems like maybe there are other things in the marine environment that are, the fish from the Mattole are perhaps being influenced by the marine environment in some slightly different way, or there are other aspects of the marine environment that are most important for Mattole fish than are most important for Klamath or Sacramento fish, for example. But it's a real head scratcher. I mean, the caveat there is that we know that we don't see all the fish, and we know that there are some years that have better survey conditions for seeing fish than others. I think that 2017-18 year was a combination of our super strong run and really good survey conditions, just enough flow that fish could get a lot of places, but not enough rain that we had these long periods of 2 weeks or more where we couldn't survey. And I think, years since then, we've had less ideal survey conditions, but still, I think the magnitude of difference there is real. And I don't actually have great theories for why.
Gotcha, thank you. So in the chat, we had a couple questions. One is the human population density in the Mattole watershed compared to the past, where that stands today versus the past. Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, and I think I do. And if somebody who's listening has a better idea or feels like I misspoke, please pipe up. In general, it's, over the last, since 1860, it's fluctuated, but it's never fluctuated that much. I don't think, my sense is that it's not a lot greater now than it was 50 years ago. And even, estimates of numbers of native people from hundreds and hundreds of years ago are a definite minefield. But I know I have read that, probably the population density of native people in the Mattole might have been fairly similar to current population density. So that's in the last 100 or so years, I don't think that's something that's changed a lot.
So the county estimates the current population at about 2,000 people in the watershed.
Thank you. So this is more of a comment, but I think just speaking to just what people can do in terms of stewarding the land is that there's a mention that there are still job opportunities with the Mattole Restoration Council and via Nick's interns for high school students to get out and do restoration work. So see, another question that just came in is where is the best place to send an email for Nathan Richard, also for Friends of the Lost Coast? So you all want to give your contact emails or a place for information, and then I'll share ours.
Sure. So Nathan's is nathan@mattolesalmon.org, and I'm R. Sykes. That's my last name is Sykes, S-Y-K-E-S. So R. Sykes@mattolesalmon.org. And I think you can go onto our website and also get our contact information.
Great, thank you. And for Friends of the Lost Coast, my email is justin@lostcoast.org, and lostcoast.org is our website as well. So you can find out information about all our various programs and lectures like this. A couple more questions came into the chat. Flora asks, is there any way to calibrate your population estimates, which I understand are based on observations of reds primarily given the variable weather conditions and thus abilities year to year of crews to get out and survey?
Yeah, the yes and no. The So a couple things. One being that there's a lot of fancy math that is way over my head that goes into the final population estimate that does to some extent compensate for that. Basically looking at repeated surveys and the extent to which reds that were previously seen are seen again on repeated surveys. But honestly, the thing that we are hoping to move to, hopefully in the next couple of years, if we can find funding, is using a sonar camera. The brands are typically Didson or Eris. Those are both acronyms. I don't know what they stand for, but basically this is something that California Department of Fish and Wildlife has been working on in various places across the state. And they've been running these cameras. They've had one in the Eel, in the South Fork Eel for a few years, and in the Mad River. For a while, there was one in Redwood Creek by Oric. And so these cameras are using sonar to generate an image of things in the water. And for the most part, the big things in the water in the winter here are adult salmon and steelhead. And so they've been working on refining using these sonar cameras in the Eel, which in some ways is it's definitely a bigger system, and in a lot of ways is a much more challenging system to do this than the Mattole. And basically, while they still have to pull these cameras out once flow gets too high, it's a way to see what's going on at high flows way better than you can with the spawner surveys where you're walking creeks and looking with your eyes for fish and reds. So this seems to be, it's also not perfect, but it's something that we're hoping to move towards, and it's being used in other watersheds to generate probably a better year-to-year estimate of the number of fish coming back.
Right, fascinating. Great question. Another question is, what was the reason from Susie? She says, what was the reason for discontinuing the hatching box program, and is there a chance of starting that up again?
Yeah, there were a couple of reasons. It seems unlikely to start back up anytime soon. So one reason for the Hatchbox program was that in the 1980s, when the Salmon Group was started, clearly there was a lot more fine sediment in the rivers and streams than there is now, and spawning success and the survival of eggs while they were in the gravel was identified as being a likely key bottleneck to the population increasing in abundance. And so in some ways, the Hatchbox program was really in response to the sedimentation issues at that time. There are certainly some parts of the watershed where that's probably still a primary bottleneck, but I think there are a lot of other parts of the watershed where that part of the fish's life history is probably not the key bottleneck to increasing the abundance of overall population. We think that in most cases, the quality and availability of rearing habitat for the juveniles is probably a better issue, or a bigger issue. So I would say, there are probably parts of the watershed, at least, where if you did run a Hatchbox program right now and, therefore increase the survival of fish through the egg stage into the fry stage and released a bunch of juveniles into that stream, you wouldn't necessarily get more adults back because the juvenile rearing habitat would already be taken by the naturally spawned fish there. So, partially I think conditions have changed, and it's maybe not such an important component of trying to increase fish numbers as it was. Also, the state's rules about handling fish and rearing fish are much more stringent than they were. There was concern about the genetic effects of rearing fish, because when you're capturing adults and taking eggs and milk, you're basically privileging the survival of the offspring of a relatively small number of adults. Because they're not being subjected to predation and red scouring out and all those other natural factors that result in a lot of mortality for little fish. If you did that, especially in a small population, over time, you very well could affect the genetic makeup of the population. On a much larger scale, this is something that fish hatcheries are definitely grappling with. But even at the small scale that it was being done here in the Mattole, CDFW had concern about the genetic effects. And the sort of state permitting, or the state's reluctance to permit the operation, was really the reason it was discontinued. I don't know. Gary could certainly jump in here. Gary Fish Peterson started the Hatchbox program and ran it for years and years and years. So yeah, Gary, if you want to say something to that, I would welcome that.
Yeah, can anybody hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I don't have enough bandwidth to have video, but I have enough to do audio, apparently. I think you nailed it, Nathan. The department's decision to not allow any more capture of adults, spawning, rearing, and release happened kind of suddenly. I think it was in the early 2000s. They basically eliminated the positions they had for supervising that. They couldn't have a program without it being supervised by their people and have their guidelines implemented. It received at the time, as I recall, quite a bit of pushback because there were, in addition to the Mattole Group, Mattole Salmon Group, there were small scale hatchbox and rearing programs using native stocks, pretty widespread throughout the North Coast. So it didn't just affect us; it affected a lot of other people and their programs. But I think that the rationales, in retrospect, were probably well grounded and maybe overdue. The genetic concerns are really uppermost. However, I think that a judicious application of portions of that program still might be worthy of reconsideration and application in the Mattole. With application to coho in particular, I've long been a proponent of carefully done what we call rescue rearing, which is capturing a juvenile coho that have already been naturally spawned, and therefore their genetics were determined through natural mate selection and natural selection processes, and transferring limited numbers of those fish to rearing tanks, rearing them over the critical summer period, marking them, and then releasing them. Marking because so you can, if you have people out on the spawning grounds doing surveys in the wintertime, you have a chance of capturing, or not capturing, but recovering carcasses that have your mark on them, so you can evaluate their effort. So I'm still a proponent of rescue rearing of coho. I don't think I have too many fans in the department, but and I know Richard has been operating in another avenue whereby adult fish from, I believe, a neighboring watershed in the South Fork Eel River, a limited number would be captured on their spawning migration, pre-spawning, and then to bring them over to the Mattole. Now, Richard can speak to that effort or that enterprise maybe a little better than I can, but that's my 2 cents on the matter.
Thanks, Gary.
On that last thing you were mentioning, that what we're calling it's a plan for coho supplementation with adult fish. We've applied for grants, but just haven't been successful in getting that grant. And that grant is just to do the planning and get the permits in for the experimental plan. And we'll keep plugging away and trying to make that happen.
Yeah, so what we're talking about, because there is concern that the persistence and recovery of the coho population is limited by inbreeding, basically, despite the fact, as I said earlier, we are seeing some gene flow from other watersheds. There's still the theory that the fitness of that population is less than it would be if it wasn't such a small gene pool. So we've been talking to CDFW and the National Marine Fisheries Service and working on this plan to potentially take adult coho from a nearby watershed and release them. And then hopefully they will successfully spawn with Mattole River fish. And that's a way to it's sort of assisted strain, a way to increase the genetic diversity of this population. There are coho salmon populations to the south of us, especially in the Russian River and down in the Santa Cruz Mountains, where their population had sort of plummeted before the Mattole's population and has been very, very low for decades and decades, and has really only been maintained through a lot of direct intervention and rearing of fish. But this is something that came out of some of their genetic studies down there. But yeah, very much just in the planning stages. And I'm just hoping actually that we'll continue to see this nice little uptick in coho numbers, and maybe we'll decide that it's not necessary.
On behalf of Friends of the Lost Coast and the Bureau of Land Management King Range National Conservation Area, thank you for tuning in to Lost Coast Lectures. To view the complete archive of recordings from this series, or to learn more about our work inspiring a passion for nature, visit Friends of the Lost Coast online at lostcoast.org.